we've talked about disaggregation, and you mentioned the death of bin Laden, but two other factors that you bring up in 2011 is the failure of the Arab Spring and how that brought about the birth of ISIS. And that wasn't a connection that I had put together. You put bin Laden, Arab Spring, birth of ISIS together. Maybe you could talk about how those three things were a turning point in 2011.
So if we remember 1st of May or 2nd of May, depending on where you were globally, the SEAL team and CIA guys kill Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad, which is an area in northeastern Pakistan. And that immediately throws Al-Qaeda into disarray. And it takes them 6 weeks to settle on who is going to be the successor to Osama bin Laden. And eventually they settle on Ayman al-Zawahiri, who's an Egyptian. He's a co-founder of Al-Qaeda with bin Laden. He's one of the most senior people in the organization. But he's not an inspiring leader. And a lot of younger people in Al-Qaeda had long seen him as kind of an old man with old ideas. And so it takes 6 weeks for them to settle on who the successor is going to be. But then it takes the rest of 2011 for all of the franchises globally to sign on to the agenda that it's going to be Ayman al-Zawahiri. So what that means is that Al-Qaeda is kind of missing in action for most of 2011. It's turned inward, focused on its own succession challenge. And that turns out to be a really critical time because that's the peak of the Arab Spring. And the Arab Spring was a huge threat to Al-Qaeda's ideology. So to understand that, we need to backtrack slightly. Al-Qaeda is a mashup of different strains of Islamic extremism. But one of the common features is that there's this belief that there are a number of apostate regimes, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, a number of other places, which are oppressing the rights of believing Muslims, and that the role of a group like Al-Qaeda is to act as kind of a revolutionary vanguard to overthrow those regimes. And Al-Qaeda's idea was that these regimes are propped up by the West, so if we attack the West and we make the West withdraw, these regimes will fall over. And for 20 years, Al-Qaeda had run that strategy and achieved basically nothing, right? They'd killed a few thousand Muslims, they'd killed a few thousand Americans. They hadn't succeeded in overthrowing any regime, and they hadn't brought any benefits to people that were oppressed by the apostate regimes in North Africa and the Middle East. Then in the first half of 2011, shopkeepers and women's groups and students and trade unions succeeded in overthrowing Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, came pretty close to overthrowing the regime in Bahrain, in Yemen. So we saw basically people power doing the job that Al-Qaeda had claimed that it could do. And for a while there in 2011, it looked like peaceful democratic protest was going to be the solution. And so a lot of people turned away from the idea of the armed struggle and focused on the Arab Spring at that time. By September, it started to go bad, and we saw the rush to elections in Egypt, which meant that Egyptians were forced to choose between essentially the old regime and the brothers, the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood. And people didn't really like either choice, but they went with the brothers basically because anybody but the old regime. And by sort of February, March of 2012, it was pretty clear that Mohammed Morsi, the Brotherhood president, was acting in a fairly authoritarian way. He was overthrown in 2013 by a military coup, and you're now back to where you were in Egypt before the Arab Spring. Tunisia was a slightly better story. Libya was a slightly worse story with the overthrow of Gaddafi. Syria was a much worse story where a peaceful protest turned into a full-on civil war within a few months. And so by the end of 2012, people are starting to realize, oh, actually, we're not going to get there using peaceful protest. And they turn back to the idea of the armed struggle. But Al-Qaeda has been disrupted by the death of bin Laden. And so instead of turning back to Al-Qaeda, they turn to this new organization, ISIS, which has grown out of our withdrawal from Iraq and the Syrian civil war, and is now a much more appealing and capable organization than Al-Qaeda. Now, Al-Qaeda actually recovered later, right? So it was a temporary eclipse of Al-Qaeda. And now we're dealing with both Al-Qaeda and ISIS as global threats. So that means we're in a much more dangerous situation now than we were at any time really since 9/11.